The next key area that we're going to be discussing now, that would be the law of supply. So what do we mean by supply then? If we say supply, it is the schedule of various quantities of commodities which producers are willing and able to produce and offer at a given price, place, and time. So if we say law of supply, the law of supply states that there is a direct relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. So, in other words, if the price increases, then the quantity supplied increases. And if the price decreases, then the quantity supplied also decreases. Now, in order for us to better understand the law of supply, let me show you an example. So as you can see, this is an example tabulation of hypothetical supply schedule for canned milk. Now, in this tabulation, it consists of two columns. The first column is what we call the price column, which is expressed in terms of dollars. And the second column, we have the quantity column. And this is expressed in terms of pieces or canned milk, okay, to be specific. Now, as you can notice, at price 50, we have 100 quantity, okay? At price 20, we have 80 pieces or 80 canned milk. At price 10, we have 50 canned milk. At price 5, we have 40 canned milk. And at price 4, we have 20 canned milk. Now, as you can notice in the law of supply, if your price increases, your quantity supplied also increases. And when your price decreases, your quantity supplied also decreases. So if we will try to plot these points to present a graphical presentation, so this is how our graphical presentation would look like, okay? So this is the graphical presentation of the hypothetical supply schedule for canned milk. As you can see on the x-axis, that is our quantity, and our y-axis, that is our price, expressed in terms of dollars. Now, at price 4, your quantity is 20 pieces. At price 5, your quantity is 40 pieces. At price 10, your quantity is 50 pieces. At price $20, your quantity is 80 pieces. And at price $50, your quantity is 100 pieces. Now, as you can notice, this is what we call our supply curve. So our supply curve is a graphical representation of the supply schedule, which shows the direct relationship of the price quantity combinations of goods and services. As you can see on this figure, other things being equal, the higher the price, the more quantities are supplied by the producer. And on the other hand, the lower the prices, the lesser the quantities are supplied by the producer. So being the producer, he is introduced to sell more since higher prices would entail bigger revenues to him. Now, this is the law of supply and is reflected by the positive slope. If I say positive slope, I'm referring to an upward sloping. So this is a positive slope of the supply curve, while upward sloping, it shows the direct relationship between the price and the quantity. So the direct relationship between supply price and quantity supplied, assuming ceteris paribus factors are held constant. Now, this economic principle indicates that an increase in the price of a commodity results in an increase in the quantity of the commodity that sellers are willing and able to sell in a given period of time. If other factors are held constant, the law of supply is an important principle in the study of economics. So the law of supply is the scientific relation between supply price and quantity supplied that capture the supply side of the market. So when combined with the law of demand, then the result is what we call the market model. And the market provides a powerful tool for analyzing exchanges, resource allocation, and efficiency. So what does it mean then? Well, the direct relation of this law means that sellers who have ownership and control over resources are willing and able to sell more of a good if the price is higher and less of a good if the price is lower. So, from a scientific method perspective, this indicates that price causes quantity supplied, or more specifically, that a change in the supply price causes a change in the quantity supplied. So, how do we work with the curve then? Well, the law of supply is conveniently illustrated by a supply curve. In a particular, it is illustrated by the positive slope of a supply curve, such as the one I presented earlier. Okay, so this is the curve that I'm referring to. So as you can notice, the positive slope of the supply curve means that higher prices are related to larger quantities and that lower prices are related to smaller quantities. So when price goes up, quantity goes up. And when price goes down, then quantity goes down as well. Now, on another subtopic, so we have there changes in supply curve. So first, in under changes in supply curve, we have two. So we will be discussing change in quantity supplied and change in supply. So in this case, we will discuss first change in quantity supplied. Now, this is a change in the price of good or service. So from original price to P sub 1, it implies that quantity supplied changes from original quantity to quantity sub 1. And in the supply curve, this is shown graphically as a movement along the supply curve, either upward and downward movement. So again, like I said earlier, under changes in the supply curve, we will be discussing two. We have change in quantity supplied and change in supply. So in this case, we are just discussing change in quantity supplied. So these are the movements along our supply curve. So as you can see on the sample figures, in my left side, you have there the downward movement along the supply curve. And in my right side, you have there the upward movement along the supply curve. So as you can notice in the change in quantity supplied, okay, as you can notice in our figure, there is only one curve, right? So you have only one diagonal line, and that one diagonal line represents our supply curve. So you need to take note that in change in quantity supplied, there should only be one curve, and that the changes will only be along your curve. So when can we say that there is a downward movement along your supply curve? Well, there is a downward movement along the supply curve if your price decreases and your quantity decreases. So as you can notice, your price sub 1 decreases to price sub 2, okay? And your quantity sub 1 also decreases to quantity sub 2. So this is a downward movement. On the other hand, there is an upward movement along the supply curve if your price increases and your quantity increases. So as you can see, your price, okay, your original price increases to P sub 1 and your original quantity increases to quantity sub 1. So if that happens, there is an upward movement along the supply curve. And finally, we will now be discussing the change in supply, or other authors call it shift in supply. So under change in supply, there are two, okay? So it's either your supply curve will shift to the left, okay? And on the other hand, your supply curve will shift to the right. So as you can notice, okay, if I may go back to change in quantity supplied figure. So this is our change in quantity supplied, right? And as you can notice in the figure, there is only one supply curve, one diagonal line. But in the change in supply or shift in supply, there are already two supply curves, okay? If that happens, meaning to say that your curve will either shift to the left or shift to the right. So as you can see, there are all in all three curves, okay? The one diagonal line colored blue, that is our demand curve. And our first supply curve is supply sub 1, okay? And the second supply curve is the supply sub 2, colored in red. Now, as you can see in our supply curves, there is an arrow in between them going to the left. So that means to say that our supply curve shifted to the left. So when can we say that our supply curve will shift to the left? Now, if you can notice in the right portion, you have their leftward shift of the entire supply curve, right? So these things being listed, these are the reasons why your supply curve will shift to the left. Now first, your supply curve will shift to the left if there is an increase in the cost of production, okay? So meaning to say, if we see there is an increase in the cost of production, I'm referring to an increase in the price of your resources. So in order for us to better understand this, let me give you an example. So supposing I am an owner of a certain milk factory, okay? So the product that I am manufacturing is a canned milk. Now, being producing a canned milk, my main raw material is a cow, okay? So I need to buy cows in order for me to be able to produce milk or canned milk. Now, if there is a huge increase in the price of dairy cows, or if there is a huge increase of my main raw material, which is the cow, then that would cause my supply of milk to decrease. Why? Since I need cows to produce milk, so an increase in the price, that key resource mean will be producing less milk. So since before I can only buy a cow for like a price of $1,000, okay? Now since the price of my main resource, okay, so since it increased, so from $1,000 before, the price of the cow now is $1,500. So meaning to say, there is a huge difference. There is a difference of $500 on the price of the cow, which happens to be my main raw material. So if that happens, instead of being able to buy 10 cows, I can now only buy like 6 cows. Okay, so there is a huge decrease in the number of my raw materials. And if that happens, then definitely it will shift my supply curve to the left. And another, if there is a decrease in the number of sellers, okay, or in the number of producers, then your supply curve will shift to the left as well. For example, in order for us to better understand this, let me give you another example. So nowadays, we cannot deny the fact that there are a lot of companies that are struggling due to COVID-19 pandemic, right? And because of the pandemic, most of the companies are put into closure or are in demise because they are struggling financially, all right? And because of that, there are only a few number of sellers or producers left. So in other words, if there are only very few number of sellers or producers, then there will also be a few number of supplies in the market. So definitely that will decrease, okay, your supply. So your supply curve will shift to the left. Another example is an increase in tax rate. So if that happens, if the tax rate is very expensive, so instead of being able to save to buy for your raw materials, then you cannot buy your raw materials because that money will be used by the company to pay your taxes obligation instead. And therefore, that will make your supply curve shift to the left. And another, producer expectation of higher future prices. So for example, if a producer thinks that they cannot make any profit on their products a few weeks from now, then of course, they will only manufacture less. So in that case, there will only be few supplies. So that will definitely make your supply curve shift to the left. So aside from that, if there is a rise in the price of substitute products, if there is a decrease in the price of a complementary goods, then these will also make your supply curve shift to the left. And finally, technology has become obsolete. Now take note that technology helps the company to be productive, right? So no advanced milking machines cause the supply for milk to increase and shift to the right. However, since your technology is very obsolete, it's outdated, and it is prone to damage, it is prone to break down or back down, then if that happens, then it will make your supply curve shift to the left, because instead of producing more, you are not able to produce more because of machine maintenance. All right. And also we have shift in supply, and your in this case, your supply curve will shift to the right. So your supply curve will shift to the right if there is a decrease in the cost of production. So if your cow, or if the price of your main raw material will decrease, so instead of being able to buy cows for like $1,000 and 500, you can now buy your main raw material, which is the cow, for a cost of $900. So if there is a decrease in your raw materials, then absolutely your supply curve will shift to the right. And if there is an increase in the number of sellers or producers in a certain community, then of course there will be a lot of supply in the market. So if that happens, then definitely it will increase your supply. So your supply curve will shift to the right. So if there is lesser tax rates, then of course the company would only be able to pay for their tax obligations in a lesser amount. So they are able to save money. And that savings, they can use that savings to buy more raw materials, which is the cow. And so for that matter, they will be able to produce more. And that will increase your supply. And that will make your supply curve shift to the right. And also, your supply curve will shift to the right if there is a fall in the price of a substitute product, and if there is an increase in the price of a complementary goods as well. All right, so these are the non-price determinants of supply, or the shifters of supply. So the first non-price determinant of supply, so again, these are the reasons why your supply curve will either shift to the right or shift to the left. So first non-price determinant, we have price of resources, or the cost of production. So take note that in production, as discussed earlier, raw materials and laborers are needed, right? So if the price of your raw materials and wages of laborers increase, it means higher cost of production. So higher cost of production reduces supply of goods. And if that happens, then of course your supply curve will shift to the left. And also second, the number of producers or sellers. So if there are more sellers in the area or more factories, means an increase in supply, and less sellers or producers means less supply of goods and services. And in technology, like I said earlier, this refers to the techniques and methods used in production. So if you have modern technology, so modern technology which uses modern machines, it will increase the supply of goods because it will make the company more productive and they are able to produce more. While primitive or outdated, okay, or obsolete technology is very slow in producing goods and services. And also we have taxes and subsidies. Now, certain taxes increase cost of production. So higher taxes discourage production because it reduces profit. On the other hand, subsidies are financial grants or financial assistance to producers which help reduce cost of production. And for price expectation, this is considered as one of the non-price determinants of supply because If producers expect prices to rise very soon, then they usually keep their goods and release them in the market when the prices are already high. Now, this creates artificial shortage due to hoarding. On the other hand, producers cut down their production due to expected price decrease, because if the prices decrease, then they are not able to make more profit. Okay, so that is why they cut down their production. And aside from price expectation, you also have price of other goods. Now, here, changes in prices of goods have effects in the supply of such products. So, if the price of a certain product decreases, then producers tend to produce other goods which can give them more profit. And finally, we have special influences. So this refers to government interventions, rules and regulations, and policies. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. So that ends our discussion for our second key area, which is the law of supply. And finally, we will now be moving on to our last key area, which is market equilibrium. So, what is meant by market equilibrium then? Now, when the supply and demand curve intersect, then market is in equilibrium, meaning your quantity demanded and your quantity supplied are equal. So, this is where your quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal. So take note that the law of supply and demand states that when supply is greater than demand, price decreases. On the other hand, when demand is greater than supply, price increases. So when supply is equal to demand, then price remains constant. That is, producers are willing and able to offer the same quantity of goods which buyers are willing and able to purchase at a given price. Now, in order for us to better understand market equilibrium and how it looks like, then let me show you an example. So if you can see in this figure, demand and supply curves are combined in the same graph in order to examine the price and quantity traded that leaves both buyers and sellers satisfied. So this leads to the creation of an equilibrium price at which the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And under market equilibrium, the graphical approach, so take note that by now, we are familiar with graphs of supply curves and demand curves, right? Now, and so for that matter, to find market equilibrium, we combine the two curves into one graph. So the point of intersection of supply and demand marks the point of equilibrium, as you can see in our presentation. So unless interfered with, the market will settle at this price and quantity. So why is this? This is because at this point of intersection, buyers and sellers agree on both price and quantity. For instance, in the graphical presentation, rather, we see that the equilibrium price, buyers want to buy exactly the same amount that sellers want to sell. But what will happen if the price were higher or if the price were lower? Well, if the price were higher, however, we can see that sellers would want to sell more than buyers would want to buy. And likewise, if the price were lower, quantity demanded would be greater than quantity supplied. So the following graph shows the discrepancy in supply and demand if the price is higher than the equilibrium price. Okay, as you can see, this is price being higher than the equilibrium price. And take note that the quantity that sellers are willing to sell is much higher than the quantity that buyers are willing to buy. So we can also see what happens when one of the curves shifts up or down in response to outside factors. For example, if we were to look at the market for Beanie Babies before and after they became a popular fad, we would see a shift outwards from the initial demand curve over time. Now, the reason for this is that As people began to like Beanie Babies, their preferences changed and they began to want Beanie Babies enough that they would pay much more for each Beanie Baby than they would have previously. So we can see this new preference for Beanie Babies in the outward shift of the demand curve. So for every price, buyers will buy more Beanie Babies than they would have before the fad. All right. So as you can see, the price is higher than equilibrium price, and you have their minimum price. Okay. And your minimum price is located just above your equilibrium price. As you can see on the next graphical presentation, this is an example of supply and demand for chocolate bars. Now, take note that this combines two effects we studied earlier, right? So there is a shift in the demand curve, which causes a movement up the supply curve. And these two effects combine to reach the new market equilibrium, which has both a higher price and a higher quantity than the previous market equilibrium. So it is only through a shift in either the supply or the demand curve that the market equilibrium will change. So why is this? Well, if neither curve shifts, nor we move along one of the curves, the market will naturally shift back to equilibrium. For example, if we look at a market in equilibrium and a store tries to move up its supply curve by selling goods at a higher price, then the result will be that no one will buy the goods since they are less expensive at the store's competitors. Now, the store will have to either go out of business or move its prices back down to equilibrium. So, what happens if both curves shift? Will we end up at the same equilibrium point? Well, in this model, it is not possible to reach the same equilibrium. Either the price or the quantity can be the same as the previous equilibrium, but not both, unless the curves shift back to their original positions. Now, to illustrate why this is true, consider the graph, consider the graphical presentation. As you can see, the initial equilibrium between supply curve 1 and demand curve 1 has price and quantity. Now, if supply shifts to supply curve 2, both equilibrium price and quantity change. So it is now possible to change back to our original price by shifting the demand curve to position 2, or it is possible to revert to our original quantity by shifting the demand curve to position 3. And note that we cannot reach the original equilibrium point unless we move the curves back to their original points. So if we say equilibrium price, it is established by interaction between demand and supply. And above the equilibrium price is your surplus, and below your equilibrium price is shortage. So in the interaction between buyers and sellers, prices tend to move towards the equilibrium price. So what is meant by surplus then? If this is surplus, it occurs when supply is greater than your demand. So whenever this happens, your price decreases. On the other hand, if we see shortage, it occurs when demand is greater than your supply. And whenever this happens, your price increases. And if we say equilibrium price, it is established by interaction between demand and supply, whereby the two are equal. And if we say price floor or floor price, this is a government intervention towards a continuing fall of the price of goods. And this is implemented during surpluses. Okay, as you can see, your price floor is implemented in your surpluses. This is located just above your equilibrium price. And if we say price ceiling or ceiling price, this is a government intervention towards a continuing rise of the price of goods. And this is implemented during shortages. And as you can notice, your price ceiling in the figure is located just below your equilibrium price. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button for the latest updates. Thank you.